In the 60s, a charismatic young man led a group of men and women out to live in a commune out in the deserts of California. They spent some time out there and they went to a Los Angeles home in August 9th, 1969 and murdered 4 people, including a famous actress. These people would later be known as the Manson family. Now, whatever they did out in the desert that made them have this desirous lust to kill, I think is described perfectly in this book. Boy, am I excited for this one, folks. Today we are talking about 1969 hidden gem, Desperation by Stephen King, one of his most underrated books in my opinion. Before I really get into this book, I want to get into Stephen King in general now because I am a huge fan. I often come across really snobby lit majors or professors who don't ever take this kind of work seriously because they're too busy reading like Pynchon or, Sherman Alexie or whatever stuff like that. But they think horror is not, you can't take it seriously because a lot of it's garbage or poorly written or graphic or draws its strength from the very nature that it's dirty and unclean and all but forbidden in some academic circles, which is why I like it. But King is king. You would be hard-pressed to find another modern writer who has a stronger presence in the public consciousness. Everybody's heard of Stephen King. People that don't read have heard of Stephen King, and to my knowledge, he has more movie adaptations than any other writer. Most of those movies are garbage, but some of them are really good. Some of them are iconic. The Shining, Stand By Me. I mean, come on. The old adaptation of It, this made him a household name. And while I don't personally think that his writing style and format really translates over to film very well, some of those, like I said, some of those iconic movies, The Shining, Shawshank Redemption, for Christ's sake, these are really good stories and they come from King's beautiful mind. Stephen King is what got me into reading. I read It when I was in high school, and I'll never forget Tim Curry's amazing performance as Pennywise in the old movie adaptation of It back in the 90s. But I digress. King's writing, because it's so popular, opened up the avenue for so many people to get into reading books. His stories range from physical monsters like vampires and aliens and to the supernatural like ghosts and spirits and demons to purely metaphysical horrors like in Lizzie's story or numerous short stories in books like Nightmares and Dreamscapes or Bizarre Bad Dreams, and people just kind of lose their mind and do weird and crazy things, purely metaphysical. I think every single major release he's had has become a national bestseller, and it's not just because he's trendy. It's not just because everyone knows his name, but it's because his stories are good. They're so much fun, and they have this depth to them that stands toe-to-toe with more traditionally serious genres of writing, which I'll talk about in this video. What is Desperation? Like I said, it's King's unsung hero from the mid-90s. It's a wild, hallucinatory nightmare story which bases a lot of the horror off real-world things that are frightening. The story takes place in a small mining town out in the desert of Nevada. Now, I don't know if you've ever driven out in the highways out there and the freeways out in Nevada when you're by yourself or you're the only car on the road. There's something really weird about that feeling. There's something really eerie about seeing. You're like out in this big open expanse of land and you're the only car you can see for miles. There's something unsettling about that. I've driven through there in Nevada by myself. I went through there during the day, it's scary. At night, it's scary. People are ripping by at 100 miles an hour. You don't see people that often. It's strange. A lot of books take some time to get into the meat of the story, but not this book, Desperation. Desperation follows a group of people that get pulled over by this huge police officer out in the desert. They get driving along, this big officer pulls them over and he starts acting funny. He starts saying strange things to him before he throws them in their cruiser and they drive back to this abandoned mining town, which stopping right there is terrifying. That alone is terrifying. Can you imagine if you're driving out on the highway by yourself out in the middle of the fucking desert, no cars in sight, and a police cruiser catches up to you going 100 miles an hour, pulls you over, acts friendly to you for the first few minutes of your guys' whole thing, and then he starts twitching and saying weird things and randomly throwing he was reading the Miranda rights to one of the people in the car, and then he randomly said, "I'm going to kill you." Just inserted in there. And the character didn't believe it. She didn't understand. She was like, "Did I just hear that?" Because he acted normal after that. That alone is fucking frightening. That alone is a very scary thought to have to deal with. King clearly spent some time driving out in the desert and wondered about this whole thing and made a book off it. Now, I don't like spoiling books or talking about plot details too much in my reviews, but this book contains some incredibly hallucinatory imagery. You have characters who have these vivid sexual thoughts forced into their head. You have people fucking liquefying to death. I mean, this book is so good and it gives you everything you want from a King novel. I mean, including a Lovecraftian villain figure, which is really interesting. But, the plot isn't everything in King's books. And that's what people don't get when they see movie adaptations, including the Desperation movie adaptation, which don't watch it. Even though Ron Perlman's great in it, it's a horrible movie adaptation. But what I'm saying is King has this particular style of writing. He has this particular style of third-person narratives specifically. Most third-person narratives in books fall into two categories. You got limited third-person narrative, where the narrator, so to speak, only knows the thoughts of one person. It's a lot like first person, it's limited. Then you got omniscient, which he knows everybody's thoughts all the time. But I would argue King has developed his own signature style of third-person narrative. It's omniscient, but the narrator's voice of who the narrator is following at that point in the book not only takes on the thoughts of that character, but takes on the tone and the language of that character as well. King makes really good use of this, mostly in characters that that are racist or show bigotry, because King will use the language of that character in third person, describing what that character is going through, and it creates this very the narrator, the third person narration really shines in that way, because usually you can only get that kind of fleshy humanism when talking first person, but King's style of third person is kind of like a strange mix of first and third person. I've seen other writers do it, but I've never seen anyone do it as good as King. Which is another thing. King's characters are all three-dimensional. Yes, he has the cliche. You'd be hard-pressed to find a King book that doesn't have one writer as the main character, but they're all people, They all have, some of the best parts of King's writings are these backstories you get to all these characters. They're a lot of fun. You get a lot of you get exposition on why these people are the way they are, and that's another thing. King has this gift for writing about groups of people. Think of it. That's following 7 kids, and they're all equally all their narrations are equally distributed. None of them are flat. They're all just as vivid as the other. And he has this way of being able to write about groups of people who have interlocking and intermixing and interacting motivations. Not a lot of writers can do that. It's not easy to do in writing and do it well, and King does it. All the characters interact in such an organic way. Another thing, this book in particular, Desperation in particular, with a lot of King's books, he has this way to build simultaneous tension between narratives happening at the same time. He does this through the literary trick of writing one chapter, and then you create a flag in the narration, a character will create an explosion, then you switch chapters to a different narration, and then that character hears that explosion. And that way you keep the tension, the simultaneous narratives happening at the same time, tense. He's got this perfectly tuned gift in it, and in Desperation, especially near the middle and the end, he really does it well. It's also impossible not to talk about Desperation without also bringing up The Regulators. Came out the same year as Desperation. It's written by Richard Bachman, which is Stephen King's pseudonym. I've heard a lot of different reasons for why people think he did this. Some people say Richard Bachman's stories are more character-based as opposed to plot-based, so I've heard King just wanted another avenue to do that. But what I think he did was he wrote under Richard Bachman for a while just to see if people were just reading his books because he's Stephen King. And he just became so popular, he was afraid people were just buying his books because of whatever, but that's not the case. Richard Bachman wrote several books that were national bestsellers on their own right before people found out he was Stephen King. I mean, this book, Regulators, follows around the same, how do I put this? it's the same characters, but they're all age different and they're different people. It's happening at the same time, and the plots to these books are connected even though they're different but same characters at the same time. They're connected through this weird, I don't want to spoil it too much, but like this dream state world. I don't want to talk too much about it. You're just going to have to read the 1,000 pages and find out yourself. I could go on and talk about the themes present in Desperation, like the power of belief, purpose, faith, desert anxiety, Lovecraftian horror, but I really could have reviewed any King book. The point I'm trying to make here is that King's writing deserves the respect that any of those literary snob writing authors do, you know, like he deserves his place with all of them. His characters are full, his characters are relatable, his characters are like people you know. You get fun little back and side stories to all King's books that really juice up the entire narrative and make it something you remember. He's got iconic villains, he's got his own style, he's got like I said, his books range from monsters to aliens to everything. There's something for you in his writing. Stephen King is my guy. Stephen King is what got me into reading in the first place. My friend gave me a copy of Firestarter with a ripped off cover, and I read that, and that like set it all off. That's maybe even the reason I started doing these videos. Stephen King is the guy, and I will defend him. I read a little bit of everything, but I always gravitate towards Stephen King. He's the guy. He gives me everything I want out of a book. His stories are also fun. They're interesting. There are some books I just trudge through just to say I read them, to be honest. Just say I read it, just to be honest. But Stephen King's books are nothing. You flip through 500-600 pages, because his books are usually a little wordy. You flip through these pages quick, and you want to read more by him. There's a reason he is so prevalent in our culture. Like, he is one of the, who's more popular than Stephen King in modern writers? Oh, wait. That's basically what I want to say. This video, yes, go read Desperation. Yes, it's one of my favorite Stephen King books. Yes, it's got great villains, it's got a great story, got great backstory, it's got a great connection. If you read this, you do have to read this. The interconnective is part of it. But really, this is more of a testament to Stephen King in general. I think you should read any book you can get your hands on. They're all good. People say he had these bad years in like the early 2000s or whatever, but even those are really good. Yes, his endings traditionally aren't that good. That's probably his biggest criticism, is his endings kind of suck. Needful Things in particular, I hated that ending straight up. That ending did suck, but that doesn't matter because it's made up by everything else about it. Go read him. Thank you. Also, like, comment, subscribe if you liked the video. Tell me what your favorite Stephen King book is. Tell me if he's what got you started on it, because I hear that a lot. And tell me what you think of Desperation, man. What did you think of Collie and Trajan the Cop, man? That's one of my favorite Stephen King villains right there. Anyways, take it easy, guys.